بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أود أن أرحب بكم في هذه المحاضرة التي تنظمها مؤسسة طابة للأبحاث والاستشارات. ومؤسسة طابة هي مؤسسة غير ربحية تسعى إلى الإسهام في إعادة تأهيل الخطاب الإسلامي المعاصر لاستعادة قدرته على فهم الواقع وسبر أغواره وصياغة رؤى يستقي منها قادة الرأي والقرار مواقفهم وتوجهاتهم، مستندين في ذلك إلى مرجعية أصيلة مع العناية باستيعاب التنوع الثقافي والحضاري والإنساني. وفي ظل ذلك يعتني قسم المبادرات في مؤسسة طابة بالعمل على بيان حقائق ما التبس على الناس من الأمور في الدين، بالوقوف في وجه التطرف الديني وإزالة الغشاوة وتصحيح المفاهيم من جهة، وبيان عمق ديننا الحنيف وقدرته على استيعاب الأسئلة المعاصرة الفلسفية أو الأسئلة التي لها علاقة بالدراسات المستقبلية. ومن الأمور التي يهتم أيضا بها هذا القسم هو البحث والتحليل المتعلق بالقضايا الناشئة في المنطقة العربية من أجل فهم أفضل لتأثيرها على الهوية وعلى الثقافة وعلى الدين في المجتمعات المسلمة. محاضرة هذه الليلة يلقيها الدكتور إريك فان ليت، وهو محاضر بقسم الدراسات الدينية بجامعة ييل وباحث زائر بمعهد الدراسات الشرقية للآباء الدومينيكان. وعنوان هذه المحاضرة هو تهافت الفلاسفة للإمام الغزالي، وحضوره في البحث الفلسفي عند علماء الأشاعرة والماتريدية. وهي تطرح السؤال التالي: هل هدم الغزالي الفلسفة أم ساهم في ازدهارها؟ فهي تناقش دور كتاب تهافت الفلاسفة في البحث الفلسفي عند علماء الكلام من أهل السنة والجماعة. بداية من الآن ستتحول اللغة من العربية إلى اللغة الإنجليزية لمن شاء أن يستعمل الهيدسيتس أو السماعات، له كامل الحرية في ذلك. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by introducing our lecturer for today, Dr. Erik van Lith. He is a lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University. His main interests lie in Islamic intellectual history, in particular philosophy from the late medieval and early modern period. His doctoral research at Utrecht University was on the commentary tradition on Suhrawardi, tracing the development of the notion of world of image, عالم المثال, from Avicenna and Suhrawardi in the 12th century up to the present. The world of image in Islamic philosophy, this is Dr. Erik's book that will be published by Edinburgh University Press in the coming April. At Yale, he is conducting research on the reception of Tahafut al-Falasifa, the Incoherence of the Philosophers, written by the famous 11th century theologian al-Gazali. The philosophical brilliance of this book is broadly acknowledged by modern scholarship, but little is known about the reception by Islamic intellectuals themselves. Dr. Erik has actually wrote a research paper that was published in the Orients. It's titled An Ottoman Commentary Tradition on Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, Preliminary Observations. It's available online. In addition to his research, Dr. Erik is concerned with the growing importance of technology and digital solutions in the field of Arabic and Islamic studies, on which he writes on his web blog, digitalorientalist.com. And I advise all of you to give this blog a visit, where you can read more about his interests and his studies and the events that he lectures at as well. All right, without further ado, I give the mic to Dr. Eric to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ahmed Al-Azhari, and my thanks also to the Tabakh Foundation for hosting me tonight. It's a great turnout, and it's a great pleasure to see everybody here, and I hope I can offer some thoughts of interest to all of you, and that we may have a fruitful discussion afterwards. I would like to touch on a variety of things tonight. So if there's something that you feel like we didn't discuss much, then please then ask, and we can take the discussion in whatever direction you would like. I'm here at your disposal tonight. So there are a couple of research interests that I'm particularly well versed in. Suhrawardi al-Maktul is one. Also, al-Gazali and the Tahafut al-Falasifa is another one. And also, perhaps especially matters of methodology and how to study Islamic intellectual history. And also really appreciate your own thoughts on that. So, all the things that we're discussing tonight, they have in common that that we're talking about the study of post-classical Islamic thought. And I use this term post-classical. I define it as the period starting with Avicenna, Ibn Sina in the 11th century, and ending with about the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. So for my own purposes, this is a satisfactory definition, seeing that I mostly study the history of philosophy and theology in the world of Islam. And for that purpose, Avicenna was really a watershed moment where a lot of things changed from before to after. And likewise, there's a definite switch in somewhere in the modern era, in the 20th century, where the discourse really takes on a very new and different outlook. So how exactly other branches of Islamic culture fit in here, well, remains a bit of an open question, but it seems that there is some sense of an integrated cultural period here from the 11th century to the 19th century. You could say throughout the Muslim world. This was recently argued in a book by Shahab Ahmed, What is Islam?, published in English. I would really recommend that to you. He talks about the Balkans to Bengal complex. So from the Balkans all the way to Bengal being one cultural sphere, if you will, with the same kind of cultural language, the same kind of poetry, the same kind of philosophy, theology, etc. Now, instead of nitpicking about the definition of this period, let's first realize why we would even dedicate our time to this period, and trying to understand the intellectual and cultural history of it. Why would we do that? And I think anyone close to the subject will know, to truly dig deeper into the intricacies of this subject, you really must dedicate your entire academic life to it. It's not just a hobby you can have. You need to be serious about it. Now, for me, there are two reasons to spend my life basically on this period. And one is that I think there's an inherent benefit to studying and understanding and even admiring the products of an advanced culture. It makes us cultural too, in a way, and therefore makes us better human beings, if you will. It's the same as going to a museum, for example, and admiring art. In the same way, you can also admire intellectual products that have been produced many hundred years ago. Secondly, I do this so that we may understand better where Islam, as a civilization, is coming from and that in itself contributes to helping deal with today's, let's say, contentious situation in which Muslims find themselves. Oftentimes, Islam is essentialized and said to have a bad essence, for that matter, by showing the plurality of Muslim expression through the centuries. This kind of contention is neutralized, right? And oftentimes, Islam is said to be close-minded, and with the great variety of intellectual interest evidenced through the centuries, this too is neutralized. So I think even for the modern discourse, for what we see, when I say we, I mean in fact mostly us Westerners in Europe and North America, what we see in the news and what we talk about together, I think there is a need to have a positive influence, if you will. Now, such allegations, right, about this essentializing of Islam, while we know that Islam is a plurality, basically, and this characterizing of Islam as sort of very stringent to its own basic principles, they come about by making convenient use of blind spots in our knowledge. So the biggest blind spot here that is exploited is the absolute dearth of knowledge on the late medieval and early modern period of Islam. So because we know so little of this period in a scholarly sense, it is very easy for people to make claims that are in fact not based on the historical reality. So allow me to illustrate this real quickly. If we talk about the history of philosophy in Islam, then what do we as humanity, what do we know about it? So you look at an introduction to Islam, a book on introduction to Islam. Well, the most popular one basically in the English language is by Majid Fakhri. In fact, he based it on an Arabic book. I think he wrote it himself first. But it's one of the really the main book on Islamic philosophy in English. And there you see how he builds up his chapters. First goes through Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, spends a lot of time on it. And then he comes to the 12th century, and all of a sudden he takes these huge leaps, and I have it here in front of me. So he talks about Suhrawardi and Persian philosophy in a span of 17 pages, and then he talks about all the tradition of Kalam from the 13th century onward or 12th century onward in about 20 pages, and then he is already in the modern era. And so the entire late medieval and early modern period is basically covered in about 37 pages or so. Now, even a book that was put together by Muslim scholars, editor is Sharif, it's called A History of Muslim Philosophy, also in English. In that book, even these authors construct the narrative of Islamic philosophy as with the 7th chapter is called The Dark Age. And it spans from 1700 to 1850, or in Hijri from 1111 to 1266. So they call it themselves the Dark Age. They really don't know exactly what to do with it. So this is a snapshot, right, of the state of affairs. And luckily things are changing, but we still have a long way to go. just wanted to mention some recent publications that move things forward. There is Philosophy in the Islamic World by Peter Adamson, which is based on his podcast. So you can also listen to the history of Islamic philosophy. Then there's also the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Philosophy and the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology. They both came out recently, and they really do their best to spend a lot more pages on this later period. Yet again, when reading it, you will also notice it's still in its infancy, and a lot more can be done. In that regard, want to mention another book by Khalid al-Ru'ayyab, Islamic Intellectual History in the 17th Century. And in that book, I reviewed it, in fact, and my review is also on my website if you want to read it. And the main point I make in the review is like, okay, this is not the last say on the 17th century, rather sort of the first say. It's like a source for future research. There is very fertile ground here, and there's so many different angles we can do more with. And I hope my own book, The World of Image in Islamic Philosophy, will make a similar kind of contribution when it comes out. But of course, this will take a long while before this trickles down to the general public. And in the meantime, these false ideas about Islamic thought and Islam in general proliferate. So this is a bit of a long introduction to the real subject at hand today. But the subject goes to the heart of the issue just described, which is why I got involved in the issue, which is why I got involved with al-Gazali and his Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. I assume you're all familiar with the author and also with the book. So you know that it's very critical of philosophy, the book. And this has conveniently been pointed out as though it gave a death blow to philosophy. So a lot of people have been arguing that, well, al-Ghazali wrote his Tahafut al-Falasifa, and then afterwards nobody dared to touch philosophy anymore, and the dark age which I just mentioned fell upon the world of Islam. So if that sounds far-fetched to you, that is because it is far-fetched, of course. And in fact, at the same time, this book has been elevated as one of the most original contributions to medieval philosophy. And there are many studies of it now available. There's a bilingual edition available, very, very nice, edited by Michael Marmera. So it's known as a brilliant book, and it's also said to have had a crucial negative impact. Yet the reception of this book itself has barely been considered. If you really go down to what scholars are saying, then scholars haven't really been researching what the impact then was of the incoherence of the philosophers. So it is known, and I think you probably also know, that the Tahafut al-Falasifa had a counter commentary. It was called Tahafut at-Tahafut. It was written by Ibn Rushd, and it's further not that difficult to find out that this text, the Tahafut at-Tahafut, received a super commentary from Agostino Nifo, an Italian scholar who wrote in the 16th century. So you can see a sort of a mini commentary tradition connecting Baghdad with Andalusia and Italy. It's a very nice history, of course, but this history takes us into Europe, and we are, of course, interested in what takes us into the world of Islam. Well, what has remained less well known is that around the same time as Nifo, wrote his commentary. Ghazali's Tahafut inspired a small commentary tradition of up to 10 texts in the Ottoman Empire. And this stretched from the 15th century until the 18th century. And it has, in fact, nothing to do really with Ibn Rushd. The people in the Ottoman Empire who wrote these commentaries had no knowledge, or at least showed no interest in Ibn Rushd, Tahafut al-Tahafut. So it's really something independent. Now, the first two of these commentaries were written at exactly the same time. They were written by Al-Adin Tusi and Khojazadeh. And then the other commentaries, they were super commentaries on Khojazadeh's commentary. So all the other commentaries were coming back to Khojazadeh's commentary. Most importantly by Ibn Kamal Pasha, a very important, perhaps the most important philosopher of the Ottoman Empire. I say up to 8 because of some of these commentaries. I've not been able to find a manuscript of these Ottoman commentaries. Only Al-Adin Tusi's commentary has been edited and published. So even for Khojazadeh's commentary, you have to use manuscript. There is an old, there is a 19th century print, but the print is it's very bad to read, and I don't know. I myself prefer to use a manuscript for this text. So I'd like to give you a sense of why this commentary tradition came about, and also what kind of meaning it has, what it has to say about Islamic intellectual history, more generally speaking. So we have a little story about how these commentaries came about, and it's Haji Khalifa who summarizes it in the Kashf al-Zunun. I hope some of you know it. If you don't know, then I really invite you to discover it. It's a real treat. Kashf al-Zunun is a book from the 17th century that compiles all the literature that was known to Haji Khalifa up until that time. So it really is a very good snapshot, to use that word again, of Islamic intellectual history. So Haji Khalifa writes that Sultan Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, of course, Sultan Mehmed II ordered Khojazadeh and Al-Adin Tusi to both write a book on their judgment of the discussion between the Tahafut of the Imam, meaning al-Ghazali, and the philosophers. Khojazadeh wrote it in 4 months, and Tusi wrote it in 6 months. They chose Khojazadeh's book above Tusi's one, and both received 10,000 dirham from the Sultan. But Khojazadeh was also given a precious robe. And that was the reason for the departure of Tusi to Persia. So the general narrative of this account doesn't need clarification. The two Ottoman intellectuals were commissioned to write their books in what is suggested to have been some sort of competition held by the Sultan to see who could write a better book. And all later commentaries seem to have been responses to Khojazadeh, which this story seems to explain by saying that Khojazadeh was perceived to be the better one, the better book. Also interesting to note, of course, that the only difference here in the outcome was the precious robe, so it was really only honor that was at stake. But this last sentence, this was the reason for Tusi to move back to Persia. So it also seems to be that this honor was so much for him that he went back, because he was, as the name suggests, Tusi, he was from Persia, he wasn't a native of the Ottoman Empire. So I'd like to point out that this story really assumes that philosophy or intellectual thought in general was not considered to have received a fatal blow by al-Gazali. That the discussion between al-Gazali and the philosophers, whoever they are, needed to be examined, and that for this examination not one but two intellectuals were commissioned. So it shows that the discussion was far from settled and both sides were considered credible. From another source, Taj Kubri-Zadeh, who wrote an intellectual history of the Ottoman Empire, he reports that Khojazadeh wrote this book in a madrasa in Constantinople. And given his entire report, it may have happened around the year 865 Hijri or 1460 Miladi. So in other words, a few years after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. In fact, looking more into it, I would say that this conquest was a turning point in the Ottoman intellectual history. So soldiers were told they could loot the city for 3 days, but they were not allowed to touch the buildings. All the buildings had to remain intact, and they were mostly repurposed. And in fact, a lot of the churches, 8 in total, were turned into mosque madrasa complexes. So in one swoop, there were a whole bunch of madrasas, seminaries, ready to go in Constantinople. So, and then when the dust was settled, Mehmed II ordered the building of a grand new mosque in his name on the site of the Church of the Holy Apostles. And this new complex, the Fatih Jami, of course, 8 new madrasas were built around it, 4 on each side. Perhaps to replace these earlier repurposed churches, I don't know exactly, but became known as the 8 madrasas. And so all of a sudden it's not just 8 madrasas, but really 8 madrasas right next to each other, so you really have a university campus right there. And then you of course need staff to fill these places, so you also see a rise in the number of intellectuals. Taj Kubri-Zadeh collected in his Shaqaiq al-Nu'maniyya biobibliographical information on scholars and doctors and mystics, and rubricated them according to roughly the era of the Sultan in which they were active. And so if we extract that information, you can see on your handout, it's the one with all the bars. If you look on your handout, it's this one right here. So you can see there the number of intellectuals as it is mentioned in the Shaqaiq, okay, according to the different sultans. So you see Uthman al-Ghazi as being the first sultan of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't really the Ottoman Empire then yet. I mean, it also had to come about, of course. Going all the way on the right, you see Mehmed II. And so you can see, it's quite visible that even if you combine all the numbers of all the intellectuals from all the sultans before Mehmed II, then it's almost as much as Mehmed II himself. So with Mehmed II, and I would say with the conquest of Constantinople, all of a sudden there is this huge increase in patronage of scholars. And from the same work, the Shaqaiq, we can also extract master and student relationships, and you also have it on your handouts, the other sheet. So this requires a little bit more explanation, right? It's a lot of names all of a sudden. So let's look at it together. So these are relationships of master and student as it is recorded in the Shaqaiq. And so it has to start somewhere. And so in our case, it starts with a Taftazani, a Sayyid al-Sharif Jurjani, and also Shamsuddin Fanari. And then on the right, you also see a little bubble from Persia. So there were also scholars coming almost on their own from Persia in what was sort of the nascent Safavid empire. But all three, Taftazani, Jurjani, and Shamsuddin Fanari, they came from much farther east, from what's in English called Transoxania, Ma Warra Nahar. And so they came from Samarkand and these cities. Shamsuddin Fanari being, of course, somebody who actually came himself to the Ottoman Empire and became one of the first to establish an intellectual discourse. And Jurjani and Taftazani never went to the Ottoman Empire, but their students did so. And so you see, if you follow from Shamsuddin Fanari, if you follow Mullah Yagan, Yagan is the third from the top from Shamsuddin Fanari, or the second on the bottom. And then you follow Yagan to Khidr Bey. Khidr Bey is right in the middle there. And so this Khidr Bey, we can see from this diagram, from putting together all this information from the Shaqaiq, we can see what a central role Khidr Bey must have played. This Khidr Bey wrote very little himself. He wrote a one poem, Qasida Nuniya, received 2 or 3 commentaries, but his influence really is just in teaching, in just being a mullah and teaching the new elite of the Ottoman Empire. Khidr Bey was assigned to be the first Qadi, if I'm correct, in Constantinople. In fact, now that I think of it, I believe Qadi Koy is a region in Istanbul, it's named after him because I believe Koy means like place or something, and he was given this place, endowed this place. So in fact, a lot of these names still live on in Istanbul. It's really great to walk around and see the Zayrak Jami, for example. Mullah Zayrak is also one of these early intellectuals around the conquest of Constantinople. And Khidr Bey also was the master of Khojazadeh, who is all the way over here, right? He's on top on the right of your sheet. So Khojazadeh, we can see he has an influence from Khidr Bey, also has an influence going even further back from Jurjani and Fanari. And you can see that Aladdin Tusi is from Persia, so here at the bottom. So you can also see that it's not without reason that I placed Aladdin Tusi here and Khojazadeh here. Aladdin was the older one of the two. So he had seniority over Khojazadeh, but apparently still lost the debate, unfortunately. So this is the context in which this played out. And I spent some time on this because these are also, all these factors are also important to take in when studying Islamic intellectual history. Because well, it gives this impression of just how much was going on in that time. And I think just a few relevant conclusions that we can draw from this is, one, simply put, philosophy was certainly not dead. It was a real issue, and there were a lot of people available to discuss it. Also, the leaders of that time allocated large sums of money and resources to stimulating the sciences. And third, scholars who were active were highly connected with other parts of the Islamic worlds, in this case most notably Transoxania. And this interconnectedness is it's one of these aspects of post-classical Islamic intellectual history that is one of the most important things to keep in mind and to put in as sort of in the center of your attention. We can see this when we also move into the contents of the book, what is between the covers of these two books, right? Of course, to work with both books in their entirety would only allow me to give a very general summary of their contents, and that would not do justice to what's actually going on, what these intellectuals are doing in their works. So, the last years I've settled on one issue, and it's covered by both authors in 3 chapters. And this is the issue of God's knowledge, or more importantly, the God's knowledge of particulars, which was a major discussion really throughout these centuries. Discussion, is God able to know particulars, meaning a particular Eric and a particular Ahmed, or is God only able to know humanity in a more abstract, universal sense? And you can, of course, immediately see how important this issue is, because if God does not know particulars, then there seems to be very little reason, for example, to pray, because God will not hear you. So it seems, from a religious point of view, something to push back against. And for these intellectuals, it then becomes a question, okay, how can we argue intellectually for God's knowledge of particulars? Because, as you can imagine, as I said, it's an issue. So the philosophers from the previous centuries, most notably Ibn Sina, they had arguments against knowledge of particulars. We can go into the details if you like, but first want to talk more just about the structure of these books, which again has a bigger potential to say more about Islamic intellectual history in general. And so we see that al-Ghazali's book, if we just look at one chapter, on this issue of God's knowledge, then we see that Ghazali's chapter is constructed very simple, on the main construction level. It consists of 2 parts, the chapter, and those are 2 proofs. Proves that God knows other things, okay? And both proofs get an objection, or I should say the first proof gets 1 objection and the second proof gets 3 objections. And then this objection gets a response. One objection is just left standing, it doesn't get a response. But so in most cases, you see a structure of proof, objection, response. So you see a very layered kind of writing there, but it's still a very simple layering, because for al-Ghazali there's not that much involved. If we then move to Aladdin Tusi's book, then we see that this construction is just much more complicated. And to extract this structure of the chapter, we as modern readers have to do a lot of work, because it's not the case that Aladdin Tusi is clearly saying like, okay, now I will do the first proof. He may do it for the highest level. He may say, okay, the first proof. But for these sub-levels, he is not really indicating anything. And an added layer to this problem is you can imagine if you're working with manuscripts, which you have to do for Hojazadeh and the later commentators, then it becomes even more just a wall of text, because in manuscripts they don't really make notes where a certain subsection or subsection begins or ends. So it takes a lot of time to tease out this structure, but once you start to do this, you see that these chapters are constructed with a high degree of, well, I'm going to say intelligence, so to say. There is a plan behind this. They're not just writing until their pen runs dry. They are really writing with a certain beginning in mind and a certain end in mind. And doing this at a much more detailed level than al-Ghazali. So for Aladdin Tusi, and I would actually, I'd like you to point out that you can read about these structures in my article. So if you're interested in this, you should look at my article, really. For Tusi, yes, he has these two proofs. Aladdin Tusi has the same two proofs as al-Ghazali. But then he has a much more extended explanation of the proof to begin with. Every aspect of the proof, where al-Ghazali would spend 2 sentences on the proof, Aladdin Tusi would take apart these 2 sentences in, say, 5 or 6 different parts and give a much fuller explanation of each of these parts. And as you can imagine then he can also start to object to each of these little parts and also write counter-arguments against these objections. So in the end, you end up with a much more complicated structure. And for Hojazadeh, just to make it short, for Hojazadeh, this counts even more so. He has, it's true, he does have a more detailed chapter structure. So what can we learn from that, right? It seems rather abstract to talk about that, but we notice then that these are not really commentaries in the true sense of the word. They don't just cite al-Ghazali and then add their own thoughts. It's not. I mean, this is what would be like a tafsir, right? A commentary on the Quran is much more straightforward in that regard. Really is you cite a Quran verse and then you expand on it. But here, well, we would like to call them commentaries, but in fact they have so little to do with al-Ghazali's text. They're much more advanced and detailed than al-Ghazali's text. So it's like the discourse as a whole, the discourse being the difference between what scholars, what philosophers were talking about in the 11th century when al-Ghazali was alive, and what philosophers were talking about in the 15th century when Hojazadeh and Aladdin Tusi were alive. The difference between them is that the discourse as a whole had moved far beyond the level it was from the 11th century. So it is more that that Hojazadeh and Aladdin Tusi bring the discussion up to the standards of the 15th century. Now, in this labyrinth of argumentation, the texts become less and less straightforward argumentation for one or the other position. This is really the big downside of these kinds of texts that we see in this post-classical period. They become so involved and so difficult that It's not always clear what the author himself then is arguing for. But on the other hand, this also reminds us really that both chapters from the Ottoman scholars read not so much as a theological discussion on what God knows, which granted it's an important question, but it also seems a bit of an esoteric question. It's much more a philosophical discussion on what knowledge is, on the definition of knowledge. And God is merely a test case, so to say. God is, of course, a very extreme being that knows. So it's always interesting to test your theories under extreme conditions. So to test your definition of knowledge, to see how it applies to God, is a good way of seeing how good really your definition of knowledge is. So we can come back to that later, but just want to touch on another issue here, and that's that because of this labyrinth of argumentation, I said the author's opinion is not always very clear. Well, there is in fact also another reason why the author's opinion is not always as clear. And this is that they are copying or citing a lot. They are using earlier sources a lot to construct their own argumentation. Just to mention the most frequently used scholars, we have Isfahani, who died in 1348, Aduddin al-Iji, Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi, so that's Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi Takhtani, and Sayyid al-Sharif Jurjani, also a very popular source for both of them. So these are, in fact, all scholars. We call them theologians, but really they're also philosophers, of course, from the 14th century. So really just a century older than, 100 years older than the two Ottoman scholars. A notable outlier in their sources is Fakhreddin Razi, who died in 1209, right, was a 12th century scholar, and of him various writings are used by the Ottoman scholars. So it seems that that beyond their immediate predecessors, the likes of Iji and Jurjani, they found in Fakhreddin Razi their intellectual who they admired, and not al-Ghazali. And the last point I want to make in this regard is that their contemporaries, like Mullah Fanari, Shamsuddin Fanari, and like Ali Kushji, they are absent, at least for this issue on God's knowledge. They are absent voices. And to immediately add to that, it's also important really to clarify that this is what I've found myself. The Khojazad and Aladdin Tusi are not saying that they're citing, they're simply using it. And so only by going back yourself to the text of Jurjani and Fakhreddin Razi, etc., are you able to find, like, wait a minute, this sounds very familiar, this is pretty much exactly the same. And the interesting thing is, when you then look, okay, so who is mentioned in the book, in the two books? It's mostly their adversaries, if you will. All the philosophers are mentioned. Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, so those are all Greek philosophers, right? And then Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, Ibn Sina, Bahman-Yar, student of Ibn Sina, As-Sukhrawardi, that's my or our Sukhrawardi, Nasruddin Tusi, and Qutb-ud-Din Razi. And as you can guess, Ibn Sina, Nasruddin Tusi, and Qutb-ud-Din Razi, they all have to do with the Isharat wa Tanbihat, the work by Ibn Sina, which was very popular philosophical work and inspired many commentaries. And Tusi and Razi, they wrote important commentaries, and we can see that here they're used. So really among this group of philosophers, it is interesting that also Fakhreddin Razi is also mentioned by name. So that's again a piece of evidence that Fakhreddin Razi was a sort of a role model for them. Now, if you want to call Fakhreddin Razi an Asharite scholar, that's fine, of course, but this identity seems hardly at stake here. So we arrive here at the title of this lecture, or at least the title in Arabic. Both authors, they really never refer to Asharis and Maturidis in their entire work. There's one exception. Al-Din Tusi once speaks of Al-Ashari and his followers, but that is it. So these terms are not used at all. Instead, what we find as terms for groups or schools of thought are, okay, we have al-Falasifa and al-Hukama, so those are terms that are used for philosophers, the ones that I just mentioned by name. And then there are, of course, terms that are put against that group. And Al-Din Tusi likes to use the term al-Milliyun, so the people of religion, if you will, rather general term. And he constantly uses al-Milliyun against a term like al-Falasifa or al-Hukama. And other terms that he uses are al-Mutakallimun, al-Ukala, and al-Muhakkikun. Khojazadeh, on the other hand, uses much broader variety of terms. Doesn't really settle on one term, but does use a lot the terms al-Mutakallimun, al-Muhakkikun, al-Ukala, and also Arbab al-Milal wal-Shara'ir min Ahl al-Islam. So, I mean, I would then say that basically we see that there are a couple of terms in common between Khojazadeh and Al-Din Tusi, namely al-Mutakallimun, al-Muhakkikun, and al-Ukala. And then two terms that are different is that Al-Din Tusi uses al-Milliyun, so the people of religion, whereas Khojazadeh uses al-Arbab min Ahl al-Islam. He adds this min Ahl al-Islam to it. So perhaps Al-Din Tusi was was also more inclusive in thinking of other religions, whereas Khojazadeh wants to emphasize that we're talking here of those intellectuals from within the fold of Islam. But it is interesting here that these three terms, al-Mutakallimun, al-Muhakkikun, and al-Ukala, are used by both frequently. And so these are the terms really that are used by by intellectuals from this period. And especially the term al-Muhakkikun, I think, is interesting. It really points out, I spoke about this in another lecture earlier this week, about the importance of the term tahqiq and the term muhakkik. These were terms that were used by everybody, it seems. And by everybody, I mean, I not only read these Sunni Aqidah kind of texts, Kalam, Aqidah works, but I see all kinds of works, and they're also used by, for example, the followers of Ibn Arabi. They would also use a term like al-Muhakkikun to refer to themselves, and tahqiq to refer to themselves. So I think it's a very interesting discussion going on here, what tahqiq really means and what muhakkik really means. And I think there's much more to it than meets the eye. And so I think then that a term like the Asharites and Maturidis, they are just not that much used. So this brings me basically to the main point I want to make today. idea that I've had, and it's the first time that I'm talking about it. That you know that these labels then are perhaps not that useful in our analysis. If they are not that much used, then really, what is their use, and should we use them? You know, these Ottoman scholars, these texts that we talked about, they're not fringe texts. We can't just discard them and say like, well, just because these two texts don't use these terms, it's that doesn't mean anything, because they were written by prominent scholars. As we saw them at the center of intellectual circle, and just the book itself, which they comment on, the Tahafut al-Falasifa, is very important book, of course, and I think the absence of the labels Ash'ari and Maturidi, well, it's therefore telling, I think, and perhaps the reason can be found within the Tahafut itself. We know, of course, that al-Ghazali was a self-confessed Ash'ari thinker. But perhaps with a book like the Tahafut al-Falasifa, and also with other books, he has written many other very influential books, shifted the discourse of the Ash'aris, and by extension the discussion between Ash'aris and Maturidis in a decidedly different direction. So to close, I hope we can pick it up in a discussion. These Ottoman commentaries on the Tahafut, they have been sort of neglected, and this negligence is basically due to, well, you could say, a couple of scholars in the late 19th century mislabeled them, and or simply ignored them and said, well, there's no other commentary than Ibn Rushd. And then you see that scholars after them, they just assume that you know that their analysis was right. Well, in fact, there was no analysis to begin with, and so they copy this again. And so we see that through the 20th century, really, in the scholarly literature, I'm talking about academic scholarly literature, there is virtually no mention of Khojazadeh and Aladdin and the other 8 commentaries, because they had this misconception that there simply weren't their commentaries, or if Khojazadeh was mentioned, that this was not really of worth of studying, so to say. So we see that a small misstep can actually have quite a big influence on scholarly knowledge in general, and the scholarly community later on. And in the same way, I think it is. I think there is issues at stake here by using labels such as schools of thought prematurely and not rooted within the sources. Only when I went back to the sources of Khojazadeh and Aladdin Tusi did I realize that these are in fact very interesting and very original commentaries, and they do a lot of interesting stuff. So I think in the same way, the only way to proceed with this post-classical period is to return to the sources, even if it takes to read from manuscripts and do the editing work that is necessary. Not through a lens of a specific period or a region or a school, but simply with the focus on the text itself and the intertextuality that is going on, which seems to determine to a great extent the content, style, and the importance of the text. Yes, the case of the commentaries on the Tahafut al-Falasifa show that in this way there's still much exciting material to cover that has largely been forgotten so far. Thank you.